Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Matt Pines. He is a management consultant at Krebs Stamos. He's appeared on the podcast previously. He's appearing here in a strictly personal capacity. He's an incredibly smart and brilliant interlocutor about all things cybersecurity and technology, and we had a great wide-ranging conversation about those issues. Matt is also very interested in unidentified flying objects and aliens, and that sounds a little bit crazy, and I think it sort of is, but he raises some interesting points that even a skeptic like me has to pause and at least listen to. So I thought I would have you guys listen as well.
And hey, listeners, there will be a link to a survey in this podcast. It would be great if you could just answer a couple questions for us about who you are, why you're listening to the podcast, things like that. Should only take a couple minutes of your time, would be immeasurably helpful for us. So if you can do that, check out the description of the podcast. Link is there.
My email address is jacob@cognitive.investments. Email me if you want to learn more about the research services that we provide to clients, or about the money management services that we provide to clients, or if you just want to talk about anything that we're doing at CI, any books you think I should read, or any podcast guests you think I should have on the show. We recorded Friday, April 7th. This should go up Monday or Tuesday at the latest. Cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, Matt, it's so good to have you. Well, I think technically your first appearance was on the Perch Pod, so your first appearance here on Cognitive Dissidence since we did the rebrand. It's nice to have you back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, why don't we start in a slightly silly place, and then we can back into seriousness from silly, because a couple, was that months ago now? Time has no meaning for me. We had Emily on the podcast, and she and I were arguing about the cybersecurity risks associated with TikTok. And I took the position that the Chinese government should, they can find as many of the cat videos that I sent to my wife and my other friends as they possibly want. I don't see any cybersecurity risk whatsoever, unless you're like dumb enough to be in like a top secret government installation and you're on a network and you're using it. Okay, but like, are we really that concerned about it? And since then, we've had these mega hearings about TikTok and dragged TikTok executives in front of the House. And, everybody's focusing on this thing that to me feels completely unimportant. So tell me, what should I give a frack about this? Or is it really just meaningless and we should be looking elsewhere when it comes to the very real issues that there are with China and cybersecurity?
Yes, I think TikTok is a serious issue, but I would not rank it near the top of the list when it comes to either the bilateral relationship and the sort of structural and strategic challenges therein, nor even at the top of like the cyber-specific sort of subdomain of that strategic challenge. I think relative to its overall importance, it has gotten much more play than it deserves, but doesn't mean it's not necessarily important. I view it, more as a symptom of this larger condition that the relationship is suffering from for a whole host of reasons. And so I find it revealing more for what it says about that larger context than about, say, TikTok per se. And in particular, the movement that has, generated as a result of those hearings and kind of the political momentum that has been seized by folks inside the Senate, in particular with things like the Restrict Act and other bills that had been in motion, were sort of put to the fore using the sort of media attention that hearing gained to then justify what are much more strategic and much more sweeping sets of technology restrictions, capital flow restrictions. So there's a whole movement to impose constraints on the bilateral flow of capital, of people, more restrictions on technology exports, national security reviews of those cross-border investments. So that is really where the action truly is, in my opinion. That's like the most significant development in the past few months. TikTok is, I think, definitely generating more headlines, but it's a symptom of that larger trend.
All right, and listeners, you won't experience this because of our seamless editing over here, but apparently China was listening to my little diatribe there, or Matt's answer, I'm not sure which, and completely short-circuited. It looked like your computer to me. Maybe an electromagnetic pulse hit your office. I'm not quite sure, but we're back. And I wanted to come back at you and ask, well, so if you were controlling the House agenda, if you wanted the American people to have one cybersecurity issue with China that was emblazoned on the front pages and that everybody was talking about, like, what do you think that most important issue would be from a U.S. perspective?
Well, so the thing about cybersecurity is it's more a domestic issue of just like getting our own stuff together than necessarily as a China issue. Certainly there are specific nation state threats to a wide range of industries that China has a strategic interest and objective in targeting, specifically for IP theft. And those companies are the folks that we engage with professionally, and they have particular interests in mind that they need to bolster their security programs. But for the wider kind of national mass public awareness, it's really just understanding the basics about cybersecurity, and that's like not very sexy. That's not like China's coming to get you, right? It's just not getting scammed, not getting spearphished, not getting your credit card stuff stolen, not getting your bank account hacked. Like China is not trying to target the median American. Where these things really trip is less in the cybersecurity specific domain and more in the structural relationship between US and China that the median American is not aware of necessarily, but has certainly benefited from in the past 20, 30 years of globalization, right? Like this basic economic arrangement that has been built over many, many years, redounded to the benefit of, say, like the median consumer, while it certainly led to the erosion of, say, the manufacturing base in the country and left us somewhat strategically challenged when it comes to, mobilizing our defense industrial base. But like that is really where, like, if you're trying to like draw attention, it is really more, this is the fundamental contradiction that we have to resolve as Americans, which is, we have this chimeric economic system and production system for global trade that we have, really benefited from. And yet at the same time, the political momentum on both sides of the Pacific is starting to pull away from that. And the sort of quote unquote decoupling or de-risking momentum is starting to run into inherent tensions between commercial prerogatives and objectives that, sustain global commerce and strategic political objectives, military objectives. And now that we really had an honest conversation with the median American about what are we really willing to do to, punish China, to hold China back, what costs are we willing to bear in order to achieve that, national strategic objective? And where are those trade-offs? And what are we willing or not willing to do? And in particular, this gets, really into the Taiwan scenario, right? Because the median American likes getting the next iPhone, right? But are they willing to go to war to ensure they get the next iPhone, right? Like these are kind of the implicit trade-offs that, we want to prepare the ground for, so there isn't kind of this, all of a sudden strategic crisis, and you've got to either mobilize national unity to defend Taiwan in some, acute contingency, or you don't. And I think that is really where I would focus the conversation. Get a password manager, do the basics, don't fall for dumb tricks, cybersecurity basics, right? If you're a corporation, certainly be much more well attuned to, the widening bullseye of nation state targeting for your IP and just general economic espionage. And then this more strategic conversation about what is this future of our bilateral relationship? What are our trade-offs? And be politically honest about those things.
Yeah, so we're recording Friday, April 7th. This will come out on Monday. Apparently, this 3-day patrol that China announced in the Taiwan Strait should technically be over by now. They said they were going to inspect ships in the Taiwan Strait in different parts of it. Doesn't seem to me that they've actually inspected any ships or gone there, but it was new for them to say that. And as followers of me will know, I freaked out about that a couple days ago because that cuts against a lot of things. But I think you raise an important point, which is what if China had boarded a ship, or what if it boards a ship here in the next 3 days before this podcast drops? Taiwan has said they want to go help defend whatever ship gets boarded. The U.S. has a carrier battle group in the region because we were exercising with Japan and South Korea. Is the U.S. actually going to go risk the entire global trade system and everything else because China boarded a ship in the Taiwan Strait? We're already seeing fatigue about sending money and weapons to Ukraine in a much more sort of black and white conflict between sovereign nations where we recognize both parties as states, let alone this kind of weird Taiwan thing. So, I could talk about the Taiwan issue all day. I don't think Americans at all understand the trade-offs that we're talking about there. Mm-hmm. Maybe I could ask you to put on Well, how do I want to ask this question? I want to flip the question on you and say, let's say the Chinese Communist Party approaches you and wants to talk about cybersecurity. And you're talking about, I mean, obviously, you have to don't get spearphished in China. I'm sure there's way more actors in China that are nefarious, trying to hack bank accounts and this, that, or the other thing. But if you were thinking about it from China's point of view, do they have similar concerns? Are they worried about the United States and corporate espionage on their top trade secrets? Is there any kind of balance there? Or is it really... the question I'm trying to ask, I'm trying to see if from their point of view, it looks the same or if it's completely different, or so we have all the tech, so they're trying to crack into our sort of, intellectual property safe house. Help us understand what this looks like from the Chinese perspective.
Certainly, I think that there's a historical analog, which is a rising economic power and political power challenging the status quo power, right? That has lots of dimensions, but this particular one is all about the leading edge of whatever the industrial technologies of that era are where the focus of a lot of state and sort of state adjacent economic espionage takes place. And then we saw this back in the Industrial Revolution era, and U.S. essentially copying and stealing a bunch of British technology to invigorate our own domestic economy. Like, this is just the way things are done, right? Like, if you want to put the neutral, objective, moral hat on, I think from China's perspective, they see this as their way to kind of accelerate up to get to the level that they think is historically justified. That they were sort of held back artificially by the West. This is their sort of national storyline, and that all these things are justified essentially to bring themselves back to the rightful place that they think they deserve. I think there is a qualitative, and of course, like, we fundamentally, do similar things at the state level to engage in espionage. We don't do, at least as far as I'm aware, this type of like broad scale IP theft, and in particular because most of the IP we hold, and we just don't have the production processes, right? So China dominates most of the production. They're trying to climb the value chain. So structurally, they have the most significant interest in acquiring that next piece of the sort of value chain IP and start to do some of the technology transfer activities. So their whole sort of economic system is really predicated on this to a certain extent. And they have a really sophisticated apparatus that isn't just purely an intelligence, organs. It extends throughout kind of their industrial and technology bureaucracies, their science and technology, their academic labs, their state-owned enterprises, the military. It is really a whole of government strategic objective to achieve the commanding heights of the sort of next generation technologies. And they have set these strategic plans, marking targets for where we're going to go after certain advanced technologies. And we want to create, domestic national champions that are, global leaders in these key industries. So it is a qualitative difference. And from the United States perspective, we see it as a strategic threat. From they see this as like, this is just the 21st century, economic great game played, just the game that, all the other great powers played. So we're going to play it just using 21st century tools. That's their perspective. But the sort of the asymmetry in terms of who's targeting who at what scale, it is clear. China by far, order of magnitude from any other peer actor in the system, the global system, is just on a different level, right? They have, you can imagine you think there's like a size that they won't go, right? In terms of like 100% company that's like a startup that has some interesting, IP, say on some aerospace thing. It might be 50, 100 person company. You think they wouldn't, target that. No, they might have like a dedicated PLA unit, like 5 or 10 guys. And their sole job 24/7 is just to get on those people's networks, persistence, and just see everything they're doing as long as possible. And not just like, hack them and shut them down, but just to like monitor their whole progress and then feed everything back into the internal Chinese ecosystem, where whoever sort of like an internal marketplace essentially to sell that information. So it is a very systematic global effort. And it's quite, it's become now, like, I think much more important, especially as this sort of decoupling tension has, and I think will drive China more towards that type of more covert activity, whereas before it was much more overt joint ventures, right? Just doing partnerships with Western firms and just having conditionalities for giving access to that IP as a condition of getting market access. Now that, the risk of operating in China has gone up post-COVID, everything else that's happened in the relationship, the opportunities to facilitate technology transfer through those other, say like more like white side mechanisms are going to be more difficult. And so this is going to force them to be much more aggressive on the sort of covert side, insider threat, economic espionage facilitated by cyber means. It's only going to grow.
Yeah, we had John Minnick on the podcast earlier this year, and he's literally getting his PhD in technology transfer between U.S. companies and Chinese companies. And some of his research is actually really interesting because it shows that for the real important stuff, for the real high value stuff, it just hasn't worked for China. Like a lot of these U.S. firms didn't want to sort of give them the most important things. And now that you're sort of in this environment, I take your point about them wanting to push back. I have two other questions I want to draw out from there. The first, we'll stick with China because I don't want to only talk about China because China's not the only actor out there and is probably soaking up too much of the oxygen. But I do want to ask in the context of especially nearshoring, how from a cybersecurity perspective, maybe U.S. companies should be thinking about this. The example that I always come back to is a country like Mexico. So if the United States is really going to nearshore, Mexico is the ace in the hole. Mexico is the thing that makes the whole nearshoring process even feasible and realistic. We can talk about the specifics of why. But Mexico, even though it is overwhelmingly dependent on the United States from a trade and economic perspective, it doesn't necessarily like that. It would love to have some kind of counterbalance at all. And when you start get into, well, who are they using Huawei equipment for their 5G network? Are they going to solicit cooperation from Chinese companies? Things like that. Does it get to the point where if you're a U.S. company and you're active in Mexico and there are Chinese, entities or officials or companies running around Mexico too, is that just a back way to get everything that you want? That your company could be absolutely perfect, trained in making sure none of the Nigerian princes hack your mainframe, but then you're in Mexico and suddenly the whole thing goes? How is that a pressing concern? Because in some ways that seems to me to be the weakest link here for the United States. It's much easier to play offense against one country than it is to play defense in countries everywhere across the world. So much so that it almost seems like a fool's errand.
Yes, and in general, like the tagline is, as you change geographies, you change your threat vectors. But some stay the same, and some get reintroduced. Some new things get introduced. So Mexico specifically, there's both technical risks, there's like insider third-party risks, and there's like political and operational risks that you would consider. Like specific on the technical side, much of the Mexican internet runs on PRC made kit, right? So like that makes the technical environment for backend collection like unchanged relative to PRC. So if you were a target of the PRC, like moving to Mexico wouldn't make their job any harder, right? That's like the bottom line. It doesn't make it any easier per se, but you're not necessarily, just because you're outside of say the Chinese internet, their kit is basically running on the Mexican internet. So if they wanted to target you, it would be very straightforward. And Mexico remains very reticent, sort of politically, to jettison that PRC kit, specifically Huawei, from their network. So that's probably likely going to remain, an ongoing sort of threat vector. There are also like new risks that get introduced. So like insider third-party risks in particular. So you decrease the chance of like technology transfer through this sort of joint venture, direct access, et cetera, when you're operating in China. Though it creates new kind of local insider third-party risks, not necessarily to China, but to other, say, criminal groups in particular that operate inside Mexico that have maybe a different interest, but still pose a threat to compromising operations, stealing information, maybe, redirecting supplies, right, for criminal activities. And it also, if you are a target, right, for whatever reason, PRC can increase what we call close access operations to obtain information, that they want to get. Now, that's like probably low on like the threat level for most companies. But operating in China isn't necessarily a denied area for operating in Mexico is not a denied area for China. There's obviously like the operational disruption risks depending on where you operate in Mexico, right? There's like Monterrey and kind of the northern area that's like kind of the green zone, right? That all the Western companies are going into. But most of Mexico is like, look at like the State Department travel advisory, it's like all yellow and a lot of red, right? And so depending on where you're setting up makes a big difference. And like everyone is kind of clustering in a handful of areas and the government kind of knows that. And so you're kind of setting yourself up potentially some constraints, right? Because you've got limited freedom of movement. There's lots of, say kidnapping or ransom sorts of risks. On the cyber element, one thing that hasn't been well studied yet inside the cybersecurity community is the cartel's movement into cybercrime. Most ransomware activities are dominated by sort of Russia and Eastern Europe and mostly like Asian criminal groups. South America and Mexico, Central America haven't really gotten too much into the ransomware game. I think it was Mandiant put out a report, maybe in late last year, earlier this year, identifying a group called Fin13, which has interest in sort of leveling themselves up in cybercrime and targeting specifically in Mexico, targeting corporations. Now, this is, not necessarily like across the board, but it is a trend that's increasing. One thing that I worry about, and this is just more speculation, right? So like this isn't part of the like mandate reporting or anything like that, is that the groups that are currently running most ransomware activities globally are, that was their first entry into criminal activity, like organized crime was basically, and it's become very much like a platform as a service, like ransomware, become like a very low bar, like barrier to entry for anyone to kind of, get in the game at different scales and sort of like become an entrepreneur in ransomware and start with like 1 or 2 kids and then, grow your operations as you scale and get more sophisticated. And it's pretty easy to get access to tooling and pretty advanced capabilities. It's a very sophisticated kind of global criminal marketplace there. But that's like their first entry into most organized crime. In the cartel world, that is like taking folks that are like right now doing much more violent crimes and then moving into cybercrime. I don't think we have much of a good case study of what other sorts of tactics, would sort of accompany ransomware, right? Especially if you're operating locally in an environment where they have like physical access to you and your company's operations. Like this idea of like ransoming just, like I'm going to brick your systems could come with other threats that could be credible. And that hasn't actually materialized. This is more speculation. But this is something that, I think folks coming into Mexico, like Mexico is not the NAFTA days, right? It's a very different political environment. And China in particular, like cyber threat, isn't necessarily going to be fully mitigated. And there's going to be some novel threats that you may face, locating there. This is to say that like it's a no-go zone or like this should stop you from doing this sort of nearshoring. There might be other business reasons why that makes sense, all things considered. But it's an important risk that I think most C-suites may not have fully internalized, especially if the sort of mental model of Mexico is, baked from like the late 90s.
Yeah, that metaphor of ransomware as a service is like, and I'm going to try and make that the title of the podcast. We'll see if my producer goes for it. I have this vision of like, a version of Shark Tank, and these hackers go on and present their ransomware entrepreneur platform to 4 sharks, and they're like, "Oh, I really love this. I'm going to fight over it." Are there any places that are like, what are countries from a nearshoring perspective that are safe, that are sort of, if your top concern is like security or intellectual property and it's not Mexico, what's on the dartboard? Or is it really just, it's probably like, the cheapest state you can find in the United States?
Well, it's interesting. So like the nature of the internet is that geography becomes less of a first order function driving your risk, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, if you're operating in China or operating in countries that are using Chinese kit, and if China is the top of your threat, in your threat model, like they're top of your list, then you would want to avoid those countries where, that back-end infrastructure is still there, right? And so you could look at where the public internet is run by Huawei. You could look at countries that are, members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, usually implies there's some back-end military intelligence relationships. It means that those jurisdictions are likely going to be very permissive for Chinese intelligence operations, et cetera. So there's certainly like, you can map out certain areas and say, okay, like if China is my main threat, then these are countries, geographies, maybe I wouldn't want to, locate like critical servers, et cetera. But if you're a target of a nation state actor, right, like they're not going to let that be an obstacle to getting to you. And so there it's more about, okay, thinking about your own internal security program, how you've structured, your different, measures to protect what you need to protect. And that's kind of more basic cybersecurity stuff, right? And it's sort of geographic agnostic. Where do you put your crown jewels? How do you control access to them? These sorts of things are standard kind of, business security, cybersecurity programs. And you have to think about geography, but at a certain point, that becomes less relevant than just specifically how do you design those security programs? How do you test them? How do you ensure that they're keeping up to date with the relevant threats that you have to prioritize?
Is there, going back to the ransomware question for a second, is there a historical analog in human history for what you were talking about, Asian financial groups or groups and cartels and things like that who can use ransomware, non-state actors that can really go after both states and corporations with this level of sophistication, steal things? I mean, are they just modern 21st century data pirates, or is there something really qualitatively different about organizations like that being able to use the internet and use technology, to your point, to make the advantages and constraints of geography kind of disappear?
It is actually, I think, a fundamentally new sort of threat to businesses. And it is one that is, I mean, you can just people become kind of numb to the headlines, but there are billion-dollar or at least several $100 million ransomware attacks on major multinationals almost weekly. And these can have pretty substantial effects on on entire industries, right? There was a semiconductor kind of niche firm, I think it was called MKS, that suffered a ransomware attack. It was pretty severe, shut down their operations for multiple weeks. And that cascaded through the industry because they manufacture a critical component, and because their operations were shut down, they weren't able to fulfill orders for a lot of their customers, and those customers then had to make updated filings, and it became a probably $1 billion plus incident. Didn't make most of the headlines, but that happens a lot, and a lot of companies are realizing this can be an existential risk to their business, and that is kind of a new thing, right? You didn't used to have this 0 to 1. All of a sudden, now there's a new existential threat to my business. It usually would take pretty catastrophic business decisions, or you get nationalized in a coup, or there's certain things that would be really extreme for your business to just go to zero, right? Ransomware does pose that threat to some companies, to an increasing number of companies, and that is something that a lot of corporate America has had to grapple with the last few years. And you're seeing a lot of movement now happening both on the policy side, the regulatory side, on the national kind of security side, because we're realizing this is now taking on increasing national security dimensions. And it's become such an important, significant threat to many multinationals that it's starting to shift our overall posture to how we do kind of defend forward cyberspace operations run by the National Security Agency, Cyber Command, et cetera, to proactively disrupt those criminal gangs, as a matter of national security. So going after criminal groups using the military cyber capabilities. This has happened before. It's now becoming much more systematized. What's interesting also in the recent national security, the national cyber strategy that was just released, is there's this is one of the 5 pillars they identify, which essentially, disrupting adversaries, including ransomware groups, which are considered Russia, China, these are they put them on the list of major cyber adversaries. And there's some language in there that essentially harkens back to you may use the pirate metaphor, letters of marque almost, right? That there could be developing essentially this ecosystem of nonprofit defensive organizations with really advanced cyber capabilities that private industry could eventually be to use to defend themselves proactively against criminal groups. So this is very much in that sort of trade is developing, and the pirates off the Barbary Coast are attacking us, so we need to have our own cyber mercenaries essentially to guard our shipments of data as it goes through the digital seas, so to speak. That's a terrible metaphor. But this is sort of this Darwinian process of evolution where the threat has grown so dramatically, being such a threat to major businesses that and the government doesn't have resources to defend everyone, right? And so this creating this really complex dynamic at play where the companies want to protect themselves. Legally, it's a lot of gray areas, right? Of are you violating laws by hacking some other system, and what are the terms of that? And that's increasingly being tested. The line about what is permissible for, say, private actors to do to proactively defend themselves against these sorts of threats is moving, and we're sort of testing each limit of that line. So yeah, it's become a major issue. I mean, a lot of our clients, right? Ransomware is one of the top threats to them, right? And they always they need to have a plan. They need to have a way to understand at the C-suite and the board level. Increasingly, the SEC is putting out new regulations that require that for public companies, they have at least one member of the board who's the cybersecurity, has cybersecurity expertise. And this is increasingly drawing attention of most regulators. It's a major issue. we have some private equity clients, and they wanted to know, right? Like, what do we do if one of our portfolio companies gets popped by ransomware? And it was really enlightening to do those exercises and walk them through. And then all the sort of main directors, like, have a realization that, oh, this goes from like an annoyance of my otherwise very busy day to being like existential to my job. Because like, like my investment in that, like, this is my P&L could go to zero, right, very quickly. And that tends to focus attention. And so that realization is happening more and more. Hopefully you had the realization before you face the acute existential crisis. This is sort of a lot of what we do, is like try to help, focus attention on these things before you get in a bad spot. But yeah, it is a big issue.
Forgive me if this is a dumb question, but because because you could listen to that, and probably listeners who are like me, who are not extremely well versed in cybersecurity, will listen to that and throw up their hands and be like, well, then I'm just screwed. Like, if somebody wants to come after me, if they have enough resources, they can come after me. Is there anything you can do, like from a physical perspective? Like, let's say a small country like let's say Guatemala wanted to become the cybersecurity safe haven of the world. Is there some way that they could like build physical infrastructure that wasn't connected to the rest of like the global internet or something like that, that would allow them to like control everything on that network and protect against hackers? Or is that am I just in a completely utopian, you don't understand how this stuff works kind of situation?
Yeah, it's I mean, in a global internet, which is functioning like global services trade, right? Most businesses now are internet businesses in the sense that they buy and sell services and some goods along the way. And that fundamentally means you have to be connected. You have to have suppliers, you have to have clients, you have to have open access. Innovation comes from having scale and having access to, all the key markets. So if you're just like, trading in a, semi-autarkic zone, and you don't need to have global internet scale driving your market, yeah, you could probably set something that up. But in general, like, most corporations fundamentally have to be global networks, right? That's like the business model now. And it's that model of global operations then really doesn't work with what you call like a fortress mentality. Like, can I just put bigger walls around my operations? Fundamentally, this is moving what's called like zero trust architecture, which is kind of like the cybersecurity buzzword, but it doesn't really have a canonical definition. But generally means is like this idea of there being like a solid, periphery that you control the endpoints, and then everything inside is trusted, everything outside is untrusted. It's moving to a model where you sort of have layered defenses, and you have really tightly structured permissions and security controls around certain parts of your network, data, tools, etc., that are really delimited and that have, they're tightly structured, so that if you get compromised from any particular area, doesn't mean your whole business goes down, right? So fundamentally, you can protect yourself and you can mitigate these existential risks by doing some kind of common sense things. They take time, they take attention to implement, especially in large, complex organizations. But it's not like you could just avoid the threats coming. It's more, how do you prepare to mitigate these tail risks and turn something that would otherwise be an existential event to your business to being just like a bad week, right? And that is really a lot of what, in the cybersecurity world is all about, is like turning something from being like a catastrophic risk to being a manageable risk. And you can do things that are pretty practical and cost effective, to that end. And that gets more technical, and it depends on the nature of the business, right? Are they, have all on-premise services use cloud? How much these third-party, how much third-party dependencies do they have? That's where it really gets into the nitty-gritty. A lot of what we do, and an increasing risk. A lot of companies are now having to, reposture for. There's always like the target's always changing, right? Because the technology landscape is changing a lot. A lot of companies are becoming more digitally enabled, and these dependencies are growing. And a lot of companies aren't just like building their own tech stack; they're bringing in vendors to provide different services for them. So like a company now is like a stack of lots of other different products from other companies. And so you inherit the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of those other companies by plugging their products in to your business value chain. And sometimes those can be like the most significant sources of compromise, right? So that was the big SolarWinds compromise a few years ago, which was this, kind of, no one really had heard of them unless you're like operating in that space. But, their software was used by like all the Fortune 500 and most of the government, right? And so that became a vector for the Russians to put in essentially a backdoor and get into a whole bunch of networks. China has done something similar with other software vendors that are like, in the supply chain, that like we call the digital supply chain. And this is becoming the new battleground in cybersecurity is, okay, looking at your third-party risk, looking at those dependencies, looking at your upstream and downstream, and it's not just, okay, who's attacking me, but if someone else, right, is being targeted, right, but we share, right, a key piece of software, that vulnerability that might be developed for that other target makes me vulnerable too. And so there's this growing recognition, there's essentially collective action problem associated with cybersecurity, right? And where does the division of responsibility and liability really lie, right? If you make a compromised piece of software and you push it out to everyone in an update, and that, the compromised software, leads to, you suffering $1 billion ransomware attack, who's liable for that, right? Right now, it's not clear. There isn't established case law. This new national cybersecurity strategy, associate implementation plan is trying to shift the boundaries of liability more to the software developers, right? To make them have to ensure and essentially commit to getting their software to be secure. How that happens in practice and how that gets litigated, that's a big issue. But this is changing the landscape of a lot of those regulatory environments.
Well, and that also raises the question for me. I mean, I feel like when you're thinking about the future of industry and things like that, it's all artificial intelligence and automation and all these Internet of Things, all of which require still more data flows over larger networks with more, as you call it, different stacks and different modules, all these other things. Is any of that realistic in this environment? Even artificial intelligence itself, I mean, that's a whole subject unto itself, and we've only just begun talking about it on this podcast. But we can't even secure the current system we have. So now we're going to figure out some secure way to engage with ChatGPT or other artificial intelligence sort of use cases. That just seems totally pie in the sky based on everything you just said.
I mean, it can still happen, and it could just create more risk. And you could just get into a world where more and more things break and more business suffer these sorts of major failures. And it's just a increasing sort of deadweight loss spread across the economy over time. And we could decide, and it could end up being something we can keep growing in spite of, right? But you could get to a position in time where several percentage points of GDP are lost as a result of cybercrime annually, but you're still growing at 5 to 8% GDP because AI unleashes massive productivity gains, right? So you could live in this weird, Schrodinger's world where the costs associated with this sort of increasing dependency and sort of cat and mouse game between expanding cybersecurity threat capabilities and leveraging tools like generative AI essentially that are also being used on the defensive side to do more improved detection, monitoring, and incident response, which is what's happening now, right? Essentially, both defenders and offensive actors are using these tools increasingly. And, it's like everything else. It's kind of a technologically driven arms race. And there's kind of a race, to bring the latest capabilities in before you get targeted. And this is why, this is going to continue to grow. I don't think someone's going to be in a position to, stand for history saying stop, right? This is going to happen. It's just going to be a much messier world. I don't think we're going to have a lot of good priors to lean on to determine just how it evolves. I think structurally, though, what this is going to mean is going to be much more state involvement in these sorts of things. Because as the costs accrue across more and more industries that are increasingly being seen through a national security filter of critical infrastructure, then the requirements to put in place different measures are growing. And those are only going to be a one-way ratchet of more state regulation, oversight, and in the limit, state control to defend, right? But if the state's going to defend something and put you inside their regulatory perimeter, then they kind of need to control that perimeter. And so this is where you could see a gradual move towards more, centralization of commerce as, both nation state threats and the general geopolitical tension drives, but also just the proliferation of more advanced tools to a wider range of threat actors in the global system that any individual company can't defend against in a cost effective manner. And so you need to pull your security, right? And that's the sort of definition of the state is you monopolize the security function. Everyone agrees to sort of outsource that security function to a third party and, give up certain controls over their, sphere of freedom and maneuver and decision making in order to get that security, right? And it's sort of a weird medieval kind of dynamic, right? They're these different fiefdoms have to then kind of pull together their capabilities. And this is a big tension though, because they don't want to give up all of that autonomy, right, to the state. And that's where you're in this move of public-private partnerships across these different industries. And you have infrastructures in place already. They're called information sharing advisory councils for like many critical industries. Like there's a health ISAC, a financial services ISAC, an aviation ISAC, et cetera. And those are like convening nonprofit organizations where, all the major players in a particular industry can get security briefings from the government. Information can be shared from the law enforcement intelligence community on threats and how to, defend and protect against them. And so that infrastructure is in place. CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. So my boss, was the head of that. Helps stand that new organization up. That's been their main kind of driving, impetus is how to, again, like they can't control everything, but how do you generally up level the foundational level of capability across industry, especially as the levels of threats are continuing to increase. Now AI is a new dimension to that, right? The question is how does that how does the pace of that change really manifest in the next few years? And I think the lesson that I take away from things like GPT-4 is that it's going to be much faster than I think anyone thought. And I don't think we really have thought through the consequences of that, not just in the cybersecurity world, but just in general, right, across society. And I'm pretty sure that this is going to become an increasingly salient political topic in the United States. It's going to become a more increasingly salient geopolitical topic because AI fundamentally impinges on hardware as well as like this intellectual property dimension that is increasingly subject to state competition, if not outright conflict dynamics. And so you're going to see all of these things, I think, spin together in a sort of in an involuted loop. And I don't think I have confident predictions about how it's going to fold.
I think you're in some sense giving governments too much credit because I go back to the TikTok point. Like we're not talking about all this stuff in hearings. This is not the stuff that to your point that the median American is thinking about. The median American is thinking, oh God, the Chinese are going to see what embarrassing video I sent to my coworker online. Like the literacy rate is going to have to go up quite significantly. And I guess that's the other thing. Is this an ideal? In the world that you're describing right now, it sort of seems like authoritarian states would have a leg up because an authoritarian state can say, fuck the global commons, like we're all going to take control over these access points or whatever we need to because in the name of security of the state, we're going to do all those things. Whereas in the United States, or in any liberal democracy, first of all, much harder to convince people that they're not allowed to do things on the internet. I think we've all become accustomed to a certain amount of freedom on the internet. If you want to get real philosophical about it, maybe that's why people spend so much time on it, because you can do things in sort of, cyber realms that you can't do in the real world. So it really is this sort of manifestation of freedom. But also just look at the collective age and cyber experience of the House and the Senate and the White House. Doesn't give you much hope that, even if they do have the best advisors in the world, like was it the House where that Congresswoman said she didn't know what Substack was? Like that's the level of tech literacy we're dealing with the people who are supposed to be making these really important decisions you're talking about in terms of a new regulatory environment for a completely unprecedented technological world. So I don't know, take that. It's not even really a question. It's more like a sigh of exasperation, but give me some hope maybe somewhere.
Yes. So I think you're seeing a trend globally along a number of dimensions, right? So at the macro dimension, you're seeing the securitization of lots of other types of policy that wasn't previously securitized, right? And this is most acute in the U.S.-China relationship, like the trade war, increasing financial restrictions, export controls. Like that's the most like on the spectrum of like intensifying the securitization of all these bilateral sort of policy dimensions. That is like the most acute, but it's versions of that tension dynamic are playing out globally, even between erstwhile, allies, right? Like Europe has a data protection law, right? The GDPR, the United States doesn't. And that has created a lot of tension between multinationals and which obligations supervene others. And, this is an additional cost imposed on Western companies, et cetera. And you have a lot of governments moving to essentially treat domestic data, right, as a national resource and put in place laws that try to restrict the cross-border, flows of those data, and put into place lots of restrictions also on the use of their citizens' data for things like social media, training AI, et cetera. You've seen Italy, ban the use of ChatGPT. This is going to become an increasing dimension. You could call it, either the balkanization of the internet, splinternet. I think it's gonna be very messy. This has like the software regulatory policy dimension, but it also has like a hard, like technical dimension of like the actual connections in the internet. like which fiber optic cables are laid by which which international consortiums, right? And we're starting to squeeze out the Chinese consortiums and basically try to compete over who's laying which cables to which populations, and effectively like who's got which intelligence collection on each other's pipes. And that is like, this is going to be a dimension of state competition. How that plays out in terms of like domestic citizens' sphere of what they consider freedom of expression, I think it's gonna be like a few layers down from that, and much more conditional depending on which political jurisdiction you're in. I don't think it's going to be necessarily determined by the nature of the technology. I think this relates to just where technology is going, and does that net empower the individual relative to the state, or vice versa? And I could see it going in different directions. It depends on like a lot of conditions. Like in general, periods of increasing state competition will mean that the state tries to pull more resources and impose more controls on the private sector in general. And like the limit of that is war, right? When you have war, the state is a totalizing force. All resources are and personal decisions are constrained in the interest of winning the war, right? And so if we get into a U.S.-China war, like that's really bad for individual freedom, right? In general, that's just how wars go. Now, up before you get to that limit, right? Though, as you increasingly try to securitize these dimensions of regulations, and as the threat landscape evolves to make you reliant on the state for protection, that also is going to mean you have to defer more to state authorities. Now, I also have another view that like fundamentally though, state capacity is, you pointed out, right, is limited, right? And you could argue is in a more decaying mode than in a like reinvigorating mode, right? Like most of our institutions were post-war institutions, vertically integrated bureaucratic control structures to fight and win continental scale conflict, to mobilize hard resources and fight and win those wars. And we just were left with those for the past several decades. They were not designed to live in a 21st century, digital environment where these new sorts of technologies and tools are empowering various types of self-organized groups, actors, individuals that have much more capability than the state, had previously had to posture for. And so who's going to win that race? Is the state going to be able to like get back in the game as a nexus of institutions that actually have capacity to regulate and prosecute these conflicts? And which model of governance can more effectively instantiate institutions that can manage the proliferation of these more widely like accelerating technology capabilities? I don't know, right? China's pitch is that they've been able to model a sort of techno-governance system that wields AI as a tool for surveillance and control, which is very attractive to many other countries in the world that want to have their cake and eat it too, want to have the benefits of sort of a technological society without the risks of empowering, the individual to topple their authoritarian government. So that's their authoritarianism as a service being pitched and sold around the world. Things like Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, their digital currency, all these things are essentially a package deal that they're trying to posture and pitch to most of the world and say, here's a techno government stack. You can essentially subscribe to it. You just have to, but now you're in sort of the Chinese techno sphere of influence. The U.S. doesn't have a national plan to like compete with their own stack. We have a disaggregated set of, semi-oligopolistic competing interests. We have like the core infrastructure that we dominate, but we don't necessarily control it, and that's a subtle difference. So yeah, that was a meandering answer to the question that really answer. Who's going to win? I don't know. It's hard to say. I hope the individual wins. I have hope that certain technologies are going to enable more individual flourishing, more individual autonomy in general, and I think things like generative AI and other things could do that. But there's other countervailing forces, and especially if we avoid an acute crisis, I think in general the individual will be more empowered. But if we hit an acute crisis, especially up to and including war, that's when hegemon's going to hegemon.
Yeah, you didn't make me feel much better there. Before I let you go, Matt, I promised that we would talk about aliens a little bit at the end of the podcast here. I did a little bit of research ahead of time because you sent me a couple things that I should know about, like, for instance, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, which was looks like it issued its first report in June 2021. It has since become the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the AARO, as of July 2022, and is putting out reports. Apparently, our tax dollars are hard at work going to these organizations, putting out reports about unidentified flying objects in the United States. And I read a couple of the reports. Doesn't seem like they're that concerning to me. But I know that you've said that I'm a little too flippant about this, and that we should actually be thinking about this a lot more seriously. So we started the podcast this way, and let's end the podcast this way. Why am I being too flippant about unidentified flying objects and what that means for U.S. national security?
Yes, I could go on for hours on this, but I'll give you kind of like the bumper sticker or like mental model to how I think about this, right? So I think there's like 3 concentric circles, because I think when you bring up this topic, people jump to like the most speculative, most kind of fringy, right, sets of hypotheses, and I would put those in like the third circle, like the outer rim, or if like you're in a forest clearing, right? You're like, okay, I see the clearing I'm in, and then I can see a little bit into the forest, right? I can see some of those trees, and then it's just all darkness, right? And this topic, most of the speculation and the attention is like in the dark forest, and there I think there's really little perch, like we don't have much to get a grip on, right? So I want to start like in the clearing, in the center of the circle, things that are like objectively true, that are like most people haven't paid much attention to, right? And so you pointed to those reports, the establishment of the all-domain all-domain anomaly resolution office. Like in that vein of like in that center circle, like hard facts are like the 2 laws that were passed, right, that were co-sponsored amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act, led by Senators Kristen Gillibrand and Marco Rubio, a bipartisan amendment. Reading just the statute language that was put into that authorization is extremely revealing about where and how seriously the U.S. government is taking this topic. And in particular, like Senator Gillibrand, senior senator from New York, sits on the intelligence community. She leads actually the emerging technological threat subcommittee on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So she's as plugged in as it gets in terms of like knowing where the cutting edge in terms of special access programs in the United States government, where we think the Russian and Chinese are in terms of hypersonic technology, et cetera. She is, and she's inserted a lot of language into these things that are explicitly about, not China, not Russia, not US, something other, right? And she has made a lot of the statements, suggestive statements, among other people. Mitt Romney has made very suggestive statements. The senior folks from the Pentagon that were running some of the Pentagon UFO programs have come out and said explicitly, this is not ours, it's not Chinese, it's not Russian, advanced capabilities, we don't know what they are, et cetera. Increasingly, like the rumor mill now is that the Senate is going to host another hearing next month on UAPs. This may be a public hearing, may not be a public hearing. There have been strong rumors that people have been giving in-camera testimony to the new head of AARO, Sean Kirkpatrick, who is a senior U.S. government intelligence official and scientist, PhD in physics, who's now in charge of leading this office and has to owe a whole bunch of these reporting requirements back to the Senate and the House on this topic. And the testimony, which was part of what was put into place by law as like a whistleblower protection provision, is that if you were involved in any legacy UFO programs, basically for the past 75 years, literally they have in statute that there has to be a report written going back to January 1, 1945, to investigate any government efforts to manipulate public opinion, obfuscate, lie about UAPs. Have to write that report. That's due in about a year. But they also put in this provision for whistleblower protection. So if you sign a non-disclosure agreement relating to any special access program, either waived, unacknowledged, et cetera, that relates to UAPs, you can come to AARO, give your testimony, and then AARO has to give your testimony to the Senate. And that has been happening. A number of individuals have already come forward. And so this is becoming a very serious topic inside the Pentagon, which has been charged and has been wrapped over the knuckles many, many times by Gillibrand and a bunch of other senators for not taking this as seriously as they want it to be taken. Now, what that means, this is all in the center circle, right? Like very serious legislation passed, formal bureaucratic maneuvers stood up, very suggestive statements made by officials on the record, senior government officials, current and serving, et cetera. In the outer perimeter, right, is like, okay, well, what inferences do you draw from that? That's where you get into more conditionalities, right? And this is, I think, this could go on in many different dimensions, but just staying in that center circle and just looking at what people are saying on the record, what laws are being passed, what offices are being stood up, what money is being spent, serious money being spent on this. Actual government officials that were running the UAP task force that are now working for defense contractors that specialize in doing tipping and queuing, LEO, geo, satellite, space surveillance architecture sorts of stuff. Like these are people that play at a very serious level in the intelligence community, people that are, that are in the Gang of Eight, that are basically, sort of winking at you and saying, this is something to pay attention to. So that's where it is. Like I have like, those are like, say like, hard Bayesian credences that I can ascribe given the evidentiary record. And then I have like more decaying credences in inferences I draw from that, right? But when the person who was running the Pentagon UFO program for 10 years comes out and says, just says explicitly, these are not Russians, not Chinese, and not ours, and they display advanced propulsion technologies that we don't know how they work, and it is my strong belief, hint, hint, that the U.S. government is in possession of some quote-unquote exotic material. This is what he said, right? I don't know. Like, is he lying to us? He could be. Could be a psychological operation, right? I have to ascribe a credence to that, right? But that in itself is a reportable story. Why is there a senior Pentagon official coming out and essentially trying to imply that aliens exist, right? Why would that be the case? And so this is where it gets very geopolitical, right? Like, why would this be a story now, right? Why is this becoming a topic of conversation, right? This is like, there's no clear other exogenous reason why this would become a topic of conversation now, right? Right? There's no, like, no one's like asking for this to be like an issue. We got a lot to deal with, but the U.S. government has apparently prioritized it. A lot of people, very senior people in the Senate, have prioritized it. In fact, Senator Gillibrand has given, she's gotten angry in meetings, like at senior, Pentagon officials for not taking this, seriously enough and being like, you need to spend more money. She got 14 other senators to sign a memo requesting that the DNI and the DoD re-obligate existing appropriation funds to Aero because she felt they weren't sufficiently resourcing it. The budget for it is officially classified, but it's in the tens of millions of dollars, most likely. So yeah, this is like a smoke fire sort of situation. There's other things that go on in like more speculative mood, but like there's more than enough just in like the evidentiary record to say, to like wake up and be like, this is something interesting here. Why is this happening? Why do these people keep coming out and giving these statements? Like what is the movement here? Like what's this all like going towards? And yeah, like people have, literally like senior journalists have come out and said, yeah, I interviewed former military senior science and technology officials. They told me on the record, yeah, we've been trying to reverse engineer alien aircraft. So that was like a guy, his name was Nat Kovitz, who was a head for science and technology for the Navy. On his deathbed, he talked to this journalist, Ross Coulthart, and just like after months of him kind of being cultivated, he said, yes, I can acknowledge that. And then he died. I don't know. Maybe he's lying. Maybe this whole thing was concocted. But that's like, I don't know. That's a surprising thing. Did not have that in like my background. Sort of, I didn't have like any Bayesian credence to that. I had like a 0 assigned to that. Right. Doesn't mean I go to a 1, but that means I go slightly up. Right. And I look for other things that mean like, do I push that further down or go further up? And yeah, there's this reason why I think it makes a lot of, like to pull this together to a larger conversation. Right. Like, I think we're seeing an acceleration in lots of different fronts that are hard for our political systems and our institutional systems and our cultural production, our systems of cultural production to sort of manage, right? Like the pace of change, the pace of like complexity that the average citizen has to sort of manage is a lot, right? And I think this topic is just like adding like a whole nother, dimension of complexity to it, right? How are you supposed to manage the fact that we're having like rapid, explosive AI growth as we're also, confronting a potential, extreme risk of conflict with a great power, right? Oh, and by the way, the U.S. government's coming out and saying, UFOs are real, basically, and we're coming right up to the line of acknowledging that they're essentially a non-human related technology. Like that's like you have to put that on the table as like a serious thing that could come in the next few years. And yeah, there's geopolitical, there's financial implications for that. I'm aware there's folks that have been asked, to think through the financial implications of what quote unquote disclosure would be. Like they're worried about, bank runs and that sort of thing, right? Like there's a reason why if you just like suspend disbelief for a minute, it's like, okay, if it were true, right? Then you have to imagine the government would need to think through very hard about what you do when you finally acknowledge that there's a there, right? If that was the case. Well, that's like, you have to think that through, right? Because you didn't, that's not something you would do lightly, and you don't quite know what the second order consequences are. So that could be a situation we're facing the next few years. I don't know.
Well, before I let you go, like we'll just leave that tantalizing, and you'll come back on and we'll do some more time on it. But the only question I have for now, because I want to read these reports a little bit more seriously before I do battle with you on this. But is there an equivalent of Senator Gillibrand in China? Is there an equivalent in Europe? Are we only seeing UFOs in the United States? Is this some symptom of psychological trauma or paranoia that we're going through, or is Chile setting up an institution to look at UFOs, and is Australia do you have other things outside the United States that point in this direction?
Well, again, I'm not like a whole UFO buff, so I'm not read up on all of the history, but I do know that a number of European countries have taken this very seriously. I think France and Italy have actually stood up formal organizational bodies, actually for many years, affiliated with the military. They've had testimonies, etc., written formal government reports, etc., on UFOs, UAPs. Brazil had a parliamentary commission actually just last year where they had military officials, and it was all in Portuguese, so it didn't get picked up much in the Western media. China stood up their own. I think in the Chinese translation, it's basically the equivalent of aerospace anomaly objects. And they made a big press release about how they're using China's world-leading advances in AI to characterize these objects. And with the China stuff, it was always a double game with we are flying all sorts of drones over China, right? We're using lots of collection capabilities, and so there's always a double layer to all this stuff of sensitive. This is the freaking balloon thing, right? Of the geopolitical dimension of objects in our atmosphere, whether we're characterizing them accurately, is always the nation state game, right? And so China has stood up their own thing, nominally about aerospace objects, etc. So yeah, that is that's the thing. I mean, there was some documents that came out of this of Russia after this collapse of the Soviet Union, where a bunch of Russian scientists came out and basically said, we've had a program for decades looking at these things, and they shared a bunch of documents, and then the door got shut pretty quickly. So if you look at the history, this is not a new thing, right? The U.S. government has had their own programs. Go back to Project Blue Book, Project Grudge, Project Sign. All these things were they had big government reports investigating things. It was sort of poo-pooed after many decades, but it was this has been a recurring thing in both the formal bureaucracy as well as in the cultural milieu for many decades, and it kind of waxes and wanes as over time. Again, is this a psychological production? I'm just we have a lot of sensors now, very sensitive intelligence collection systems in space, in the atmosphere, underwater, and they're all picking up a lot of things that are, very hard to ascribe to a nation, or someone that has access to, physics knowledge that we don't have. And that's as a physics nerd, I'm really fascinated because I think fundamentally human civilization is downstream of physics. Whatever physics knowledge we have essentially unlocks degrees of freedom technologically that we can exploit, and that, up levels our entire civilization. And we've been coasting on 20th century physics for a while. And we just assume that's all we're ever going to do. Well, the lesson in history is that you unlock new physics, you unlock new technology. We did that with a nuke, and it was a new world. We did that with quantum mechanics. We got integrated circuits, right? So it's we have a historical proof of concept that new physics very quickly leads to new technology, changes civilization, changes geopolitics. And I think macro view is that we're discounting the possibility of a physics surprise, right? Where we have new physics, we discover new physics, and that unlocks a whole new dimension of degrees of freedom, which states would be acutely interested in because they know those historically are associated with dramatic changes in the geopolitical order, right? You get new weapons that can change the balance of power very quickly. So it would be a reason to protect any secret that potentially could lead someone in the direction of new physics as the most important secret that you keep, right? So it would explain if UAPs exist, that's a proof of concept that someone has new physics, and therefore any efforts to understand how they work, why they work, would lead you to potentially unlocking a strategic breakthrough in physics, which would be, geopolitically of the highest order of significance. So, like, again, that's all reasoned speculation, right? But like, as someone who like intensely looks at like advanced theories of physics right now and understands like where are we going, that's a whole other conversation we could have. Like, we're at a moment, right, where like we're trying to find, like, we're in this dark room and like we're looking for post-Einstein physics. We don't know where it's going to come from, but it's like one of those things where if you find it, you're in a different world potentially, and you never know how close you are until someone figures something out.
I think that's an excellent place to say we'll stop there, and we'll have you back soon, Matt. This was fun.
Yeah, next time.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.